Thank you for joining us today. This is the first installment of the 2026-2027 VOX-Pol lecture series. VOX-Pol's purpose is the establishment of a robust partnering, research, training, and dissemination network that has at its core function comprehensive research, analysis, debate, and critique of topics and issues surrounding violent online political extremism. This is the shared issue that brings us all together today. Since 2022, VOX-Pol has been coordinated by Professor Stuart McDonald at Swansea University's Cyber Threats Research Center, and we invite you to visit the VOX-Pol website, which is voxpol.eu, which is a wealth of resources. There you can find a link to sign up for their newsletter, upcoming events, and links to lectures from our YouTube channel, which is where this will eventually live. You can also get information on exciting initiatives such as the Next Generation Network and the Terrorism and Social Media Conference being held this summer in Wales. Today, we're so very happy to be featuring Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss. Dr. Miller-Idriss is a professor in the School of Public Affairs and in the School of Education at American University in Washington, D.C. She's also the founding director and chief vision officer of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, known as PERIL. She's a Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation entrepreneur and recently served as the inaugural creative lead for the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation's residency program on social cohesion in Berlin. Dr. Miller-Idriss regularly testifies before U.S. Congress and briefs policy, security, education, and intelligence agencies in the U.S., the United Nations, and other countries on trends in domestic violent extremism and strategies for prevention and disengagement. She is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 7 books, including Man Up, The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism, which is now in print from Princeton University Press, and Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right, also from Princeton in 2022. And she's currently at work with a new co-authored book with Prasha from PERIL on evidence-based prevention of hate-fueled violence. Dr. Miller-Idriss writes frequently for mainstream audiences and as an opinion columnist for MSNBC, as in other recent bylines from the New York Times, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, Politico, USA Today, The Boston Globe, and more. I can also say with a little bit of editorial addition that Dr. Miller-Idriss is one of my favorite people to work with, as she's a kind, energetic, and engaged individual in a field which is sometimes not so much. Our session today will feature remarks by Dr. Miller-Idriss, followed by a discussion where we'll dig down deeper into these issues. So with no further delay, I present Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss speaking on the role of gender and misogyny and the role in political extremism. Please.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael, for that kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here, and likewise, very much the same back at you in terms of finding people in the field who are also good people to hang out with, not just smart individuals, but people who you are happy to have a coffee or a drink with or walk around a park with, as we have done. And so I'm really happy to be here and be in this conversation. I'm going to share some slides here just to break up how people are, not having to look at me the whole time. So let me just make sure I can get this set up for slideshow. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes about my new book. I'm just going to keep an eye on the time here. And then look forward to having a discussion here with Michael and Germania and Jessica, and hopefully inspire some thinking and thoughts among those of you who are watching this later. I will say that those of you who have read Hate in the Homeland may have heard me say that I wrote it because I was irritated. I was irritated at the kinds of questions I was being asked at the time in Washington, D.C., where I live. And so I often got called in to explain things to people around youth culture and the far right in the wake of Charlottesville and the Unite the Right rally. And I had become somebody who knew something about youth culture online and memes and iconography and clothing styles. And so there were a lot of questions being asked about youth mobilization and radicalization, but those questions were coming to me from a position of sort of ISIS related or Islamist extremism, kind of what's the chain of command, and what are the cells? What do the manifestos look like? And I was, trying to explain kind of how the weaponization of youth culture was working through memes. And so I wrote Hate in the Homeland to kind of just explain it and lay it out for myself. And then man up pretty much became the same thing. And I ran across this quote by Simone de Beauvoir. She opens The Second Sex, basically describing why she didn't want to write this book. And this is exactly how I felt. I did not want to write a book on gender or misogyny, in part because I've never considered myself an expert on gender or misogyny. Not a person who came at this from women's studies. People have been saying a lot of these things about mobilization to mass violence from earlier precursors in misogyny, domestic intimate partner violence, and interpersonal violence, from Black feminists to experts in domestic violence to folks who work on the gender side for a very long time. And really what has happened is that our side of the field, as I think of it, the national security side, terrorism prevention, extremism prevention, wasn't really listening or wasn't connected to that. So I finally decided to write the book despite my hesitation, because I felt irritated by the fact that it kept going unnoticed. And so I came to think of this as really a sort of false separation between national security and interpersonal violence on the one hand, and really the invisibility of misogyny on the other, right? So that misogyny itself, as I came to see it, once you see it, you can't unsee it, became this kind of constant presence, either misogyny or some sort of gender-based motivations. And, people described the introduction to this book as sort of exhaustive or exhausting in terms of how many data points I cite. And I cut a bunch of them and put them in the end notes too. But I felt like I had to do that because I wanted people to read it and who were skeptical and basically just say, like, you can't read this introduction and not understand anymore that this is a constant, that there is a constant through line in almost every case. Yet it's invisible. And in fact, the thing that tipped the scale for me to write this book was that under the Biden administration, they released this classification system after January 6, 2021, that tried to get away from the idea of far right or far left violence. And they reclassified domestic violent extremism into three sort of big columns. One was sort of loosely, issues-based extremisms, like what they call racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, but also animal rights, environmental violent extremists, abortion-related violent extremists, all go into the same kind of column. Then there's a bunch of anti-government type extremisms that would traditionally fall on the left or the right, anarchists, violent extremists, they call it sovereign citizens, militias, all in the central column. And that left this entirely enormous group of types of extremisms that don't fit anywhere. And so they just called it all other extremisms. And essentially that is extremisms related to personal grievances, but also gender, sexual orientation, or religion, which, according to the START Center data, is the vast majority of targeted violence and terrorism and mass attacks since 1949 fall into this category. So we just had set up this classification system that it becomes sort of one of the ways we think about what types of hearings should be called or what resources should be devoted to different categories at the FBI or where people should be doing work. But this giant category where gender and sexuality sit was in all other. And so I found that really irritating. And so when I started to look at the data, one of the things I find, of course, in the US alone, 60% of mass violent attackers since 1949 have had a prior history of domestic and intimate partner violence. That's just the documented cases, the documented criminal cases, in a world where over half of domestic intimate partner violence goes unreported. And that doesn't include things like stalking or harassment or sexual assault or rape or online misogyny, right? The reply guys that are making rape threats, for example. That type of thing is not even included in there. Once you do that and include also other kinds of gendered motivations, like the Charleston shooter in an African-American church who, as he was enacting his crime, said, "I'm doing this because y'all are raping our women," right? So gendered and racially motivated intersections there. It's virtually everyone. It's not everyone. There were 2 or 3 cases where I just didn't see it in the public accounts, but really it's hard to find. And that's in a context where we still have, context of rising domestic violent extremism, including male supremacist attacks, rising engagement by women, this sort of controversial term crisis, but crisis in men and boys' well-being, meaning that there's a loneliness crisis for everyone, the data shows, but it's weaponized more easily for men who are and young men and boys who are easily persuaded in many cases by misogynist influencers who have positioned kind of hierarchies of dominance over women as being the pathway to success for life, like Andrew Tate, who has had up to a third approval rate by boys in Australia, for example, 20% in the US and the UK. And then a bunch of other issues around anti-trans violence and moral panic around LGBTQ issues. And yet gender gets relegated to other. So the argument of the book is that gender and misogyny are foundational to extremism and its violent outcomes, and that we have to consider them if we're going to especially think about prevention. Just in the US alone, to name a few, of these examples that I talk about, it's not just the ones you think about, like the Pulse nightclub or the Florida yoga studio attack or the Santa Barbara sorority attack, where we know those are anti-LGBTQ or violent incel related. It's things like the Parkland, Florida high school shooting or Annapolis, Maryland newsroom shooting, where you had individuals who either praised, let's say, the Santa Barbara sorority shooter as they were headed in, as the Parkland, Florida shooter did, or had a prior history of stalking and harassment of women, as the Annapolis newsroom shooter did. In Uvalde, Texas, he targeted an elementary school, of course, but prior to that was making kidnapping and rape threats against teenage girls online. So these earlier warning signs, and it just goes on and on. I mean, pretty much everything you can think of, particularly on the far right, but not exclusively on the far right, has a gendered or a misogynist underpinning or a history of prior domestic and intimate partner violence and interpersonal violence. This is true globally as well, of course. We have in misogynist incel attacks or terrorist groups that have exploited women, run sex trafficking rings in several other countries, just to name a few of recent cases, in Germany and Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, and others. We have users registered on English language incel forums across the world, most prominently in Germany, interestingly. And finally, what I'll say is, like, we actually do a decent job of this in certain kinds of extremism. So we talk about very publicly, and there are huge public campaigns about the exploitation of women and gender-based violence and sexual-based violence when it comes to, let's say, the Nigerian schoolgirls or the Yazidi women, or the fact that Al-Shabaab uses forced marriage as a strategy or a tactic of territorial control, or Hamas's use of sexual violence on October 7th. Those kinds of things we regularly talk about. There's a dozen, international criminal court, UN reports on that kind of stuff. So certain kinds of terrorists do get analyzed, and their motivations analyzed through gendered lenses, through the lens of misogyny, of exploitation of women. But a journalist turned over affidavits and notes and interviews he had done, and that I talk about in the book, with women who had been exploited for sale by a neo-Nazi ring here in the US as part of their financing of their operations. And in that case, where the neo-Nazi ring was broken up, even though the crimes against the women were described in the affidavits, in the legal description, no charges were ever filed related to the sex trafficking or the sale of footage on the dark web. And so we just don't collect the data. So we don't have a really full picture of how often drug trafficking, racketeering, weapons charges, which are regularly used to break up neo-Nazi white supremacist groups, for example, are also overlapping with sex trafficking charges, even though the DEA, for example, says there's a near perfect overlap between drug trafficking and sex trafficking. So it's not that we don't know these things, it's that we don't look at them when it comes to certain kinds of terrorist groups. So I'll just end here by laying out the 5 tactics that I talk about in the book, and then maybe we can discuss those in Q&A. So I argue that there's at least 5. I analyze 5 different ways that misogyny and gender mobilize extremism. I call them containment, punishment, exploitation, erasure, and enabling. Containment, I think, is the one that is the most ordinary. It's the use of ordinary and everyday kinds of misogyny to open up pathways to thinking about hierarchies of superiority and inferiority that can lead to rabbit holes that ultimately become violent. And I open that actually with I'll just put it up here, a very interesting analysis of my own hate mail, in which I discover that the hate mail that I get from men almost always involves motion. And once I realized that, it became much easier to receive that hate mail. It became cognitively quite interesting for me to analyze it, because every time a hateful message comes in, I'd look now for the motion and it's right there. And so basically, I call this containment, this idea that women should be back in the kitchen. What really bothers them is that that I'm front and center on the news, that I should go back to the shithole I came out of, go back to Russia, jump off a bridge, stay in the shadows, go rub your hands together elsewhere. You'll see here there are also anti-Semitic references, anti-trans references, neither of which are true. It doesn't matter. They're looking for, reasons to attack, but they still involve motion. And I started to see this as linked to things like lock her up or send them back or get back in the closet, right? Like other kinds of metaphors that are used and slurs to demean, but also to keep people in their place, women in the LGBTQ community. So in containment, I do that kind of ordinary work. Punishment is where I really talk about the one part that our field has done a decent job of analyzing, which is the male supremacist and violent incel world, the men's rights movements, the pickup artists, the kind of evolution of violent incel and misogynist incel actors. Exploitation is where I talk about child exploitation. Famously, that Vice News article a few years ago that had the headline, "Why are all the neo-Nazis getting arrested for child sexual abuse material?" sort of sums it up, right? That often what happens is there's an investigation about a plot, but the fastest way to put these guys away ends up being child sexual abuse material, which is so ubiquitous on their computers that and their devices that is a quick and easy way to put them away for just as many years. Same thing with the weapons racketeering or drug trafficking charges. So I talk in that chapter about the exploitation, the use of sex trafficking and child sexual abuse material as both financial and operational tactics, but also ideological underpinnings of the use of power and control and dominance and aggression over others. Erasure, I talk much more about the authoritarian weaponization of gender and gender grievances, including the erasure of LGBTQ communities and anti-trans mobilization. And then in enabling, I talk about the role of white women in particular related to the white supremacist movement, including in the new sort of social media era of influencers, including adjacent spaces like the trad wife, but also QAnon, QA moms, as we call them, and other women who became mobilized to violence or to support of violent movements in online spaces. I conclude by talking about solutions and some of the things that we need to be doing, drawing in part on the work that I'm doing in the lab in terms of prevention. And I will just stop there so that we can turn to questions.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. It's a really good and succinct overview of the book and some of the arguments. Those of us that work in online extremism, I think, the first response is that hearing your analysis rings really true, right? The ubiquity, as you call it, of this misogyny and violent misogyny within these spaces is very present once you're in them.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of focus there for a few minutes. In your analysis of these kind of online extremist cultures, you emphasize the role of irony and humor and sarcasm and et cetera in insulating these violent misogynistic kind of comments from critique. So how do for those who have not spent times on these forums and these spaces where this is so normative, how do kind of memes and jokes and the kind of just trolling discourse, how does that kind of complicate this conversation, both in terms of, what we generally call lawful but awful, things which don't violate the law but we don't want to see, and actual, criminal violations? How does that make the challenge difficult?
Yeah, I think it's like an enabling environment, right? So you get to this the ubiquitous, like just a joke, plausible deniability defense, which is, everywhere, and it's constant in teenage cultures in particular, and I think has been a super effective weaponization. I mean, a super effective use of humor and irony and satire and jokes, and by the far right in particular, to kind of mobilize and position itself as counterculture to a boring, triggered mainstream that just can't take a joke, right? I mean, I've had just in a recent podcast, somebody asked me this, but in a slightly different way by saying something like, you don't seem like a humorless person, right? But like, where do we draw the line, in terms of like jokes? And, and I think it is true, like, there are jokes, but then you know, there's humor, there's dark humor, and then and it's maybe hard to draw the line when something is offensive or hurtful. And I think when it becomes dehumanizing, when it becomes something like a kid saying, I identify as an attack helicopter, which is like a meme that circulates as a way of dismissing trans and non-binary identities, right? Like the idea that you can identify as anything. When it opens up gateways to understanding the world in ways, where there's other content circulating that is more like women shouldn't vote or repeal the 19th, right? So where it seems clever in some way to say to share Nick Fuentes's, your body, my choice, as 35 million people did after the election, that kind of video, which maybe people meant ironically, but it's still horrific to think about the actual meaning of that, right? This idea of ownership over a woman's reproductive capacity and play that joke playing on, pro reproductive rights, um, uh, slogan. So I think it's like, yeah, I don't want to be humorless either, and it's something we talk to a lot about teachers, is like, how do you know when to intervene and when a joke is not just a joke? And I often suggest that people think about just like what it might mean if your kids, we talk about this with teenagers, like if you make a homophobic joke and somebody in that group of friends might be gay and not have told you yet, like how are they going to feel, right? Even if you think it's just a joke among friends, the likelihood of someone being hurt by that is real and might be something to think about.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I want to ask one more question, kind of keeping it in the online, and then pass it over to Jeremiah. So again, one thing that I think you see a lot for those of us that work in online and digital spaces is the issue of migration, specifically platform migration. And you describe, a bit about how users kind of migrate across platforms from, you get kicked off of Twitter, you move to Gab, get kicked off of YouTube, you move to Odyssey or whatever. And so how does this kind of platform migration, sometimes called platform drift, how does it kind of reshape the violent mobilization or the potential violent mobilization and the sort of outreach? And where do you see any kind of critical points of intervention? Where can we really lean on there to combat that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, there's a couple of different things to unpack there. I think one is that the more people migrate to fringe platforms where there's less diversity of opinion, the more likely they are, the research shows, to drift further to the extremes, right? So what we know is that when you are not confronted regularly with ideas that oppose the ones you hold, people just conform, right? So it's like a kind of human nature. Most people are conformist in some way, and they start to adopt more extreme views the less they are exposed. It's one of the reasons why we need like a diversity of opinion within a spectrum of acceptable political, solutions and ideas in classroom discussions, like in colleges, right? We don't want just like the same speak to be happening, because people lose the ability to think critically about their ideas or defend them well, or debate them, right? And so when you see people migrating to more fringe platforms, that's one, likely to lead to more extreme ideas. Two, often those are platforms that don't have, I mean, the moderation is already terrible, right? And the content moderation and the standards are getting worse in many ways and are never perfect, even when they are there for mainstream platforms like Meta or whatever. But you're not likely to have any better of a situation in a fringe platform, some of which are totally unmoderated or encrypted. And, so it's just much harder for people to reduce their exposure, or for kids to have their exposure reduced, let's say, to harmful content that comes across. And this is where, a lot of what I talk about in schools and with teenagers, including just over like the holiday break with random teens I was in touch with, right, who were seeing like just horrific things come across their screen. One of the things I often ask kids is, tell me something you've seen that you didn't tell an adult about, but that made you uncomfortable and you wish you had a way to process it. And oh my God, like as a parent, the things that kids tell you they have seen, like you can't believe it. Like I can't, I mean, I've been shocked, and I study this stuff, right? It's the worst of the worst, right? At 11, right? I mean, animal bestiality, right? Disgusting porn fetish videos that pop up as a Google ad, right? Like things that are not supposed to happen, even with the safety, unsolicited pictures from strangers, even though all the privacy settings were there on Snapchat, right? Like, so what you want is to reduce as much as possible the exposure that people have to that kind of content, because it's like beheadings and violent PTSD inducing kinds of things too for kids. And the more you migrate onto fringe platforms, the worse that content is. And we, not to mention like where we are on platforms like X, which, with AI generated content too, right? Like we're in a really bad situation with content moderation to begin with, and I think those fringe platforms are going to make things much worse.
Thank you very much. I'll pass it over to Jeremiah.
Hi, so I was curious if you can sort of you spoke about how reproductive rights in terms of policy in those conversations sort of mobilizes extremism. I was wondering if there's any through your work and in this book, if there's any other narratives around specific policies besides reproductive rights. One that comes to mind is sort of the conversations around military, women shouldn't be serving in the military, for example. And I'm just wondering are there any other policies that sort of emerge in these conversations and narratives in your work?
Yeah, super interesting. It's something I'm working on right now, actually, for another book in progress, which is due March 2027. So I have a little time to write it, but among other things, it's about the weaponization of gendered grievances by profiteers and politicians, and the way that those gendered grievances are further polarizing and dividing us, Gen Z in particular. But so in the chapter on authoritarianism, where I talk a lot about the anti-trans mobilization, but also the mobilization of gender-based grievances in general, as a through line that kind of argues there's a danger to traditionalism or to the natural, order of things, etc. So one of the things you really see is that that reproductive rights are seen as threatening, of course, abortion seen as threatening, all related to the need to reproduce. I mean, it's a great replacement rooted kind of fear in white birth rates. But you also see this massive anti-trans mobilization in really disturbing and interesting ways get hold over just the last 5 years. There's a great piece in the New York Times Review of Books this month, sometime in the last few weeks, called the Anti-Trans Playbook, that tracks this as shows the initial failure of the anti-trans mobilization around bathrooms. It just didn't take. I remember when I first got to American University and Westboro Baptist was protesting in the streets against AU's bathroom policies, gender neutral bathrooms. That was like 2014. And then they just died away. Like nobody took it up nationally. It didn't become a big thing. But when, a coordinated effort came around to combat trans athletes from competing, particularly on women's teams, girls and women's sports, basically, that gained much bigger traction and enabled them to carry the bathroom debate back into play. And so it's a really disturbing but interesting case of successful mobilization based on a tiny fringe minority of the population, and a really small sort of issue for most athletes, let's say, and for bathrooms themselves, which is just, I'm sorry to laugh because it's just like the gender neutral bathrooms at AU were just bathrooms that used to be like, um, handicap accessible, basically. They're single stall lockable bathrooms that now had a sign that said gender neutral. They were always gender neutral. Like anybody could use the handicap bathroom. Like it never had a gender attached to it. It just got called gender neutral. And somehow that became a threat. Like the most absurd development, right? So it's, it's that type of thing. And then the your body, my choice, the claiming of ownership over a body, the idea that women's reproductive rights are somehow a threat, and the push to define conception, life as happening at the moment of conception, for example, including the IVF debate, which then backfired as well. So those are the kinds of things. And the curricular issue, I track the attacks on knowledge, including, Hungary, Orban's attacks on gender studies, on women's studies, the shutdown of university programs. We saw that here in Florida as well, the attacks on, what kinds of books kids can read that turned into really violent threats against librarians as well, and librarians quitting across the country because of it. So that cluster of things that I trace in the erasure chapter, which is about erasing knowledge and erasing bodies, are sort of the two, gender affirming care, bathrooms, trans sports, but also the issues of reproductive rights, and then all the curricular issues, the book banning and the book burnings.
Thank you very much. I'll pass it to Jessica.
Thanks. And thank you for this talk. It was great to listen to you. I just have a more broader question about how do you, as a researcher, how do you deal with the stuff you see in your research, the horrific stuff? Even you just mentioned you talk to teenagers and they see horrible things, but as a researcher, how do you deal with that? And also, how do you deal with the response you get to your work, the negative emails, or I think in your book you talked about voicemails after making a public appearance? Like how should we, how should researchers think about that and deal with that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different things. One, I think ideally researchers are in a community of other researchers, right? So VOX-Pol, for example, is one. My lab is one, where that community has policies and practices in place to protect people. Either in my case in the lab where we have rules about what certain people can look at, like undergrads aren't allowed to look at, terrorist propaganda videos, or even have to be careful about reading manifestos, like original content, grad students. And we have a process group that's co-directed by one of our staff members who is a mental health social worker originally, along with a mental health counselor from the university, for people who are doing the research to kind of continually process this. So we have policies and practices in place that protect and that also help people process. I also think it helps a lot. I would find it very hard to be a researcher who was just an analyst, if you will, right? I think that's probably the hardest job. For me, because I'm a prevention researcher, really, everything is toward an aim of developing tools to better equip communities to be more aware and know what the threats are. And so I think a lot of what I work on are parents, teachers, principals, caregivers, mental health counselors, coaches, those kinds of tools. And so that's very rewarding, right? Like especially the parents, and I love talking to teenagers because for whatever reason, they will tell me stuff that they don't tell their parents. And so then I get to anonymize it and share that back to adults who are terrified by it and who can make changes in what they do in schools about it. So, just one example, when I was talking to a high school last March, it was like the first week of March, and about algorithms, about social media content, how it comes to you, how violent it is, how gendered it is, etc. And a girl raised her hand and said, "You mean like you're talking about like what happened last week on February 26th?" And I said, "What happened on February 26th?" Is like 4 or 5 days later. And all the kids are nodding, the whole school, right? And they're like, "Oh yeah, that day we all got this super violent content." Well, if you Google it, Meta issued an apology on February 27th for the failure in the algorithm that led some users' feeds to be filled with extremely violent content, right? Well, all of the kids in that school said they'd seen it for 24 hours. They couldn't get it off their feeds. It was like live stream murders, suicides, animal abuse, child abuse, etc. None of them had told an adult. There's teachers and parents in the room while we're having this conversation. So a teacher interrupts and says, wait a minute, like, are you telling me that last Tuesday you saw like a live murder over lunch and then had to go take a math test? And they're like, yeah, that's what we did. And so she said, you know what? Like, they were on a school trip to Washington. I was talking to them here, and she said, I'm going to figure out on the way home a way for us to report this kind of stuff in a non-punitive way. They didn't report because they knew they weren't supposed to have their phones out, but also like, who are you going to report it to? Who would you tell at school that you just saw a murder happen on your phone, footage of a beheading or, whatever? It's just there aren't systems in place. And yet the kids described, I asked them, how do they feel about the kind of stuff that they see? And they're like numb or apathetic, right? Like not good outcomes, right? But what's rewarding to me about that, A, I'm not the one that actually looked at it. B, now I know that school has a plan in place. And so at the end of that session, they said, would you come back to, can we start a club? They said, can we start a club to talk about these kinds of things? And I said, if you start a club, I'll come back. And so I'm going back again in March to that school now in Pennsylvania to talk to them again about what's happening and what they've accomplished. So like that's super rewarding. And so for me, I think the prevention side of it is worth the outcome, but you have to be really careful. You don't actually have to see most of the stuff. I don't have to see any of the stuff I just have to hear about it. Somebody has to see it somewhere, but there's absolutely no reason for anyone in our lab. We have had this conversation to look directly at the primary source material on 764, right? The child abuse. Someone is doing that, thank God, right? But we can analyze the reports that are on that in order to develop tools for parents. We do not need to be the first ones. The FBI can rely on them or Marc Andre up in Canada or whoever it is. So I think, one of the things we advise doctoral students, in particular grad students, sometimes you feel like you want to see it all, like you have to run the gauntlet. Like you really don't. You don't have to do it in order to effectively do your work in most cases. And so I really urge people to see as little as possible, especially if there are primary source analyses already out there.
Thanks. Thank you.
I want to, in our remaining about 10 minutes, sort of move the conversation back or keep the conversation at prevention. Both of us work with youth and are around youth a lot. And, one of the things that you were sort of alluding to is that when youth see things online in digital spaces, they're hesitant to report that up. In part, they're hesitant to report that up because most parents, myself included, our reaction is like, well, why were you doing that? Why were you looking there? And so kids, presume the punitive response, the take the phone away response, the you shouldn't be in there response ways. So in thinking through sort of strategies and tactics for prevention, can you talk a little bit about how you've been effective at sort of opening up those dialogues? How do you sit down with a 13-year-old and get them to tell you the deep and disturbing things they see on their phone? I can say that the only success I've really ever had with this, and actually you and I were together at this now that I'm thinking about it, but in the days after the murder of Charlie Kirk, my high school age kids were bombarded with it because all of their friends were sending it. They were there, the video of him being shot, not for any particular reason other than sort of fascination with seeing something they'd never seen before. There was very little commentary with it. So in this spaces where a student might be on a group thread with, in my kid's case, every member of their graduating class, and they're receiving content from hundreds of people. What are the strategies to sort of get them to open up and talk about that in ways that are not seen in kind of punitive or carceral logics?
Yeah. So I think the first thing, and this is the part that, and I say this, like, it's very humbling to be a parent, right, of teens. Like it's so I'm not finger wagging here, but the first thing is like that it's hard if it's the first conversation that you have about their online worlds that is about the harmful content they've seen, right? So it helps a lot to have a cell phone contract when they first get a phone that had like start at the beginning that says like you can't download any apps and we're going to have this as a dialogue, as a privilege to have the phone, right? Whatever. And then have regular conversations with them about the content that they see, including not like the bad content, just like, hey, I don't really understand how Instagram works anymore. Like the symbols have changed. Can you explain this to me? Or what is it? What's the most fun thing that you've seen recently or whatever? Like the same way you might ask a kid what their favorite class is at the table, like their lives are online. And so talking to them about something funny they've seen is helpful. And that can open up a conversation where then you can talk to them about things like, hey, how often do you see something that makes you uncomfortable or that you wish you hadn't seen? And I think the main thing here is to try to approach the whole conversation as often as possible with curiosity, without judgment or shame. I see this all the time. I just saw it a couple of weeks ago in a conversation with parents who were worried about what something their kid had seen. And the immediate reaction, as you said, was like, you're not supposed to be on Snapchat, like, what are you doing on that app? And so it immediately starts a defensive position and a fearful position, a shamed position. And so, I think it's hard, but starting with like praise for the things they did right. Like, I am so proud of you for telling me. It's so rare. This is the number one thing that we tell kids in school is to tell a trusted adult, like, you did 100% of the right thing. It's not your fault that you got that content. That's the other thing. I had a student tell me recently that he didn't tell an adult he'd seen a live suicide because he thought he'd done something wrong to make that content show up in his feed. His first reaction was shame. What video did I hover over? Because they have been taught and learned that, their algorithms are delivering content that it thinks they want to see. And so he thought, what's wrong with me that this algorithm thinks I want that content? Like, that's a terrible thing, right? So helping them understand, like, you didn't do anything to solicit this inappropriate photo. Like, that's a full-on adult who did that to you. Like, they're not supposed to do that. You don't have to be ashamed of that. You did the right thing by telling an adult. The parental issue of the fact that you weren't supposed to be on Snapchat to begin with, that's a separate issue that might have to be addressed. But first, we're going to cover like what you saw and how proud I am of you for telling me and for talking about this. And how do you think adults should be talking to kids about it? That's another question I often ask that I love the answer to, because they always say things like the same types of things, just different levels. Just don't make it sanctimonious, or don't make it preachy, or, like they know what it's going to be like, finger wagging. And so it's hard to get it right. But the more you can be not judging and shaming and driven by curiosity and try to get the kids to keep talking on a regular basis, the better.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We're going to do another question from Jeremiah and Jessica as we round it out.
So, and keeping it along with aligned with prevention, I wanted to focus on the actor side, right? So the people who are mobilizing these narratives to engender extremism, gender-based extremism. Are there any differences that you've seen in your work between how men and women are pushing these narratives forth, right? Tradwives is not the perfect example, but sort of like, how are women pushing these narratives that harm other women, for example, and things like that?
Yes, there are some differences. I would say, like, the most vile actors, of course, and the most vile kind of discourse that circulates around like ownership of women's bodies, abuse as a mechanism of control, dominance, right? The kinds of things that Andrew Tate and others sell as subscription-based, profit-driven solutions to boys who are seeking success models for how to get a girlfriend or whatever, or get rich. There's much more exploitation imbued. There is women who promote this. Of course, you have women who are also abusers of men, of children, of women. You have women who have participated in sex trafficking, as we've seen, right? You have as madams, as recruiters, but it's more rare, and women are more likely to be historically in support roles, like sewing the Ku Klux Klan costumes, right? The robes, like, and supporting in the nonviolent ways, increasingly more likely to be in the violent side of things, right? So the enabling chapter uses Vicky Weaver and Ashley Babbitt as two bookends to talk about this transition. Two women who were both shot through a door by the US government and died, one of whom was holding her baby, and spent her days like gathering berries and selling them to support her white supremacist movement husband, right? So in support of the movement. The other was a violent actor and veteran who was shot while trying to break down a door in the US Capitol on January 6th. So, that there is a transition over these 3 decades in women's more violent engagement. And the only other thing I would add to that is that Evian Leidig actually has said and has cited some really interesting data on some of the largest tradwife accounts. Actually, the vast majority of the followers are men. And so it is really interesting. There's been a lot of talk about these accounts promoting kind of submissive views of women, but actually it's not women often who are subscribed to it. It's a fantasy for some men instead. And so I think that that's also important to realize. They are also profiteers, and they're selling something to men and to some extent to women, but it's not exclusively like shaping women's views. It's also reinforcing some of those men's views.
Thank you very much. I'll pass it to Jessica.
Yes. So in your book, you kind of talk about, or one of the main conclusions of the book is how how extremism or this gendered lens is usually a back afterthought.
Yeah.
So if we have to think about next steps, how can we make this a bigger part of our research on extremism and our research in general? What would be immediate next steps that people who are watching this right now can take? What can they do?
I think the first thing is to stop letting it be a blind spot. And so just having these conversations is really important, drawing attention to it, pointing it out. And one of the reasons why it is often so invisible is because even when there's a misogynist or a gendered motivation, or there's gender-based violence in the history of the perpetrator, the targets might be different, right? So this is where it's intersectional. And so you see that racial minorities, ethnic, religious minorities might often be the target, but actually there would have been some intervention possibilities earlier if we noticed these initial violent attacks against women or domestic and intimate partner violence, et cetera. So I think one is paying attention, having more conversations across these silos. Like in the US, these conversations, domestic intimate partner violence happens locally, law enforcement, Department of Justice, national security issues are in Homeland Security. They don't really talk about those things too much together. They're seen as separate domains. And I think that's same in academia, where these are in different divisions, different departments. We don't really have in Homeland Security, criminal justice departments like the one I'm in, people talking about domestic intimate partner violence as part of this work, right? So I think breaking down the silos and having these conversations, and also just seeing it, right? Consistently seeing it. I mean, I opened the book basically with an apology to the field for not having done it earlier, for not really having seen it. I didn't ask these questions myself. So it's not like I come at this saying like, I mean, there are plenty of people who've been working on this for decades, and I'm not one of them. And so I always had a gendered dimension to my work, but it wasn't the central focus. And so, I'm part of the problem too. And I think everyone has to own that and say like, why didn't I attend to this more earlier? And what can we do about it now? And I think just making sure it's a part of the conversation is the best place to start.
Thanks.
Cynthia, thank you so much for a thoughtful and challenging conversation. The work that you've done in Man Up offers a really critical and needed lens, as you said, that it sort of took us a while to get to, even for people who write on gender issues. For listeners who want to go deeper, I would strongly encourage you to get the book. It's obviously available from wherever you normally buy books. It's a great read, and I thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks so much. I would also just tell listeners who like to listen to things, there's a podcast that came out alongside the book produced by Long Story Short Media, in which I interview a bunch of people, including teenagers, about the kinds of things they see online, the gendered content, and how they experience some of those gendered grievances. And it's a pretty good listen, the thanks to the people I interviewed. And so highly recommend having a listen to the podcast called Man Up.
That's excellent. And we can make a link to that available when we post this in the VOX-Pol library. So
Perfect.
thank you very much, folks, for joining us today, and we look forward to having you join us next time. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.